Hildebrand and 8 lectures. This is the first lecture he's giving, and Grant was educated at the University of Michigan with a degree in architecture and a master's in architectural history. He worked with the firm of Kahn and Yagasaki. Where were they located?
Both Detroit.
I'm sorry? Detroit. Oh, they were located in Detroit too. And he taught 40 years at the University of Washington and received the Distinguished Teachers Award. He has authored 14 books, and 8 of them are in our library. Let me introduce Grant Hildebrand.
I'm hoping this is on, is it? Yes. You're doing all right? First of all, I want to thank Risa for her help. She assists with this so much. Every time I've given a talk, she's been just an absolutely essential help, and I'm most grateful. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And we should thank Ann. This was her idea. She came to me and wanted me to do a lecture or a series, and we kept at it until she put this together, schedule and all. Thank you, Ann. We're much indebted. I am much indebted. This is an encapsulation of a course that I taught at the university that took 30 hours of lecture time, so this is a condensation of some severity. It's also going to be a lecture about a set of experiences that in a way aren't around anymore, and I regret that. Let's go back, if we can, Risa, to the first slide, first image. Yes, this is Chartres Cathedral. And for those of you who have been there, I suspect most of you have, many of you have, you'll hardly recognize it. It was painted about 15 years ago because that was thought to have been the original condition, and the consequence is that the radiant glass, that wonderful glass, is washed out, and the experience that everyone agreed was one of the great achievements of Western civilization is not to be had anymore, and I much regret that. One can choose, I suppose, in restorations different things. One can restore to the original condition or not. And next slide, next image, Risa. Next one, please. Yeah. I don't think that it necessarily makes sense to go back to the original. This is the great stair at Wells Cathedral. We'll be talking about this later. As you see, the steps are worn. Would you have new ones cut that are straight and true? Going back to the original is a judgment call, and it's one that in the case of the cathedrals in France I disagree with, and I'm going to be talking about them as they were, as I suppose most of you will have seen them. Some general comments. My French is not terrible, but it's not fluent either, and I would ask your kindly judgment, your judge from mercy, not justice. Questions? If you have questions about simple clarification of what I've said, you haven't heard or I haven't spoken it correctly, that's fine, do interrupt. If they're substantive, I'd prefer that you wait until the end of the talk. I'm going to try to leave considerable time for questions and answers, for discussion with each class. I enjoy that, and I think you do, and we'll have some time to chat at the end of things. Some definitions. Can we go back to that plan, Risa? Yes. This is obviously a plan of one of the buildings we're going to be talking about. It happens to be Chartres. And just as a starter, you see here at the lower left a compass with west to your left. Almost all of the buildings we're going to be talking about are oriented in this way, and most of the cities, cathedral cities in Europe, have the cathedral as a kind of compass. We talk about the west front, and that is the front on my left. Oddly enough, this one is wrongly given its compass here. Chartres is the one exception. It's 45 degrees to the compass point, so this is wrong for this example, but I show it to pick out the parts we're going to be talking about. The projections at top and bottom are the transepts. They meet at the center at that crossing, and to the left of it is the nave. But the nave has two meanings, and we'll deal with them in the context as they occur. The central part of that is the nave, if we're talking about the nave and side aisles. If we're talking about the totality, the nave is a term that applies to all of that stuff left of the crossing. To the right of the crossing is the choir, and around it are the chapels of the chevet. Chevet. I've given on one of your handout sheets pronunciations as best I can to make sure we're understanding one another in pronunciation. Chevet, choir, nave, crossing, transepts, west front, east is the chapels, the choir typically. Could we have the next one? Yeah, and the next. We call the style Gothic. This is just a random view of a town in Europe, and I'm going to leave it on for a little while we talk about some generalities. We call the style Gothic. That certainly wasn't a name given to it in its own time. It would have been known simply as New Work or French Work, Opus Francogynon. I don't know where the Gothic term originally came from, but it's prevalent now, and we'll use it. It arose in a Europe that was making an interesting intellectual pilgrimage, one could almost say. The thought was that God's universe must be an ordered kind of thing, but the world, as they saw it and as we see it, is a very complex kind of thing, full of varieties and chaos and unpredictability and all the rest of it. And this age was looking for some resolution to this dichotomy. They were attempting to find an order that could accept and subsume and organize this chaos that is the world. Aquinas' Summa, written in the early 1200s, was a literary attempt to do that, but it also was an issue that they saw resolved in questions of geometry and mathematics. And the geometric manifestation was the cathedral. The mathematical manifestation was music. And they used these as ways of understanding or realizing a system that could accept and welcome infinite variety, and they made it. The Gothic, as we'll see, from a certain point of view, achieves exactly that, as does music, if you think about it. Music is a highly ordered system, and yet it encompasses anything from Paul Simon to Dvorak to whoever. It's an interesting idea, and I find it really compelling as a way of understanding much of what the Gothic was up to. It also came into being when there was an interest in the metaphor of light, the new light. Christ is referred to as the lux nova, the new light. And it was considered not only in that sense, but as we use it as enlightenment, light bringing knowledge or understanding. I'm going to try to cast some light on the Gothic for you in these hours. You see the point. These two considerations were driving intellectual thoughts, bodies of thought that drove the Gothic, and we're going to refer to them quite a lot. But they had to build this metaphor, the geometry as a manifestation of order and complexity. It had to be built. And this meant problems that had to be faced by the builders. And I'm going to use today to talk about those problems that the Gothic had to address. Next time around, we'll be talking about how it got addressed. The first problem is why I've put this image on the screen. A typical town, isn't it? Not only here, but I suppose in New England and elsewhere. And if lightning strikes, where is it going to hit? Fire is the most common destructive element in the records of these European churches. Fire, and you can see why it happens. If we're in it for the centuries, this is going to be a real problem. And it's answered by an interest in non-combustible masonry construction. Wooden buildings are combustible. Stone buildings, well, we've seen at Notre Dame in Paris that there too fire can be a problem, but the masonry doesn't burn. It's not a combustible material, obviously. And so attention was turned to masonry construction. But building with stone is oddly a different matter from building in wood. If we want to span this room, we can probably do it with a serious wooden beam. We certainly can go halfway, can't we? A wooden beam would span half of this room. A stone beam doesn't. Its weight is, it means it's collapse, it's fracture. The Greeks went about as far as they could at buildings like the Parthenon, where the span's very short. If you build in masonry, you must use an arch. It has a number of advantages besides its structural stability. It means one can build in small, manageable pieces. That's a great help in assembly. But it must be supported. An arch tends to expand and collapse, and it must be buttressed. It must be anchored against lateral movement. Prolonged in depth, it's a vault. And the early masonry efforts, next slide please. Next image. Some of the pilgrimage roads, this is Sainte-Foy at Conques, and I'm using it as an example of the tunnel vault, the masonry tunnel vault. Next image. It's a lovely little town on the pilgrimage roads way off in the middle of nowhere. Yes, next slide. The facade, the entryway. This was by a sculptor named Hildebrand, and I'm digressing just a little bit to show you his sculptural work. He's an engaging sculptor. Next image. Yeah. Down at the bottom here is heaven and hell. And you can see heaven here on the left, and hell is, next image, is a nasty business. You're being fed into the mouth of something. In case Albertus was a literalist, he believed these things were very real. Next slide, next image. But the interior here, you can see Sainte-Foy. It's a tunnel vault. It's arches proceeding in depth, and tall, very tall spaces. This nave arcade and the smaller units above it, and then the vault. This image doesn't represent actuality. This building is dark. And it's dark because it has no windows up high. The only windows that it has are well down on the depths. You can see the remodeled chevet where they have introduced a clerestory, a high band of windows. But in this main nave, no. It's very dark, and the attempt was made to, obviously, to counter this, to get some light in this system. Next image. Yeah, this is just a detail of that side wall. Next, please. Yeah, Sainte Foy was martyred because she refused to worship images, and this is Sainte Foy at Conk. I always thought there was rather an irony in this. There's a gutty. Next image. Yeah. The attempt was made to lighten to get light into the tunnel vault at the great church of Cluny, the largest Romanesque church in mainland Europe in its time. And it was built with windows under the tunnel vault. Next image. It's a magnificent, grand edifice. This is the chevet, the chapels ringing the choir. Grand building. The interior. Tunnel vault with ribs marking the bays. A bay is one unit of a building, and here the units, the bays, are marked out by the ribs that cross the tunnel vault. And below them is a band of windows to get light in this thing, and it seems an obvious way to do it, but it doesn't work. In 1088, this enormous, expensive, grand, iconic building collapsed. It collapsed because the vaults did not have adequate buttressing to resist the expansion that they tend to achieve. It was not buttressed, and it collapsed, and this gave a very bad name to this whole system. And what do we do about it? Next image. What we do about it, what Europe did about it, was to begin to use a tunnel vault crossed by a tunnel vault that we call the groin vault. Groin because it seems like the seam where our legs meet our tummy. A little bit too much of a seam in my case. Groin vault. Next image. I've mistaken, I've lost an image, and I'm sorry, I've got this not in quite the right order. The system, the groin vault begins, its first instance is in the Roman Colosseum, where there was a need to have a circumferential circulation, but also a circulation into those circumferential corridors. And so the groin vault is all over the place at the Colosseum, example of it, and known, therefore, to anyone knowledgeable as a mason in medieval Europe. And so it's used. This is the Church of Saint-Étienne at Caen, C-A-E-N. It was put up after 1066 by William the Conqueror, having conquered England at the Battle of Hastings. This was, in a way, a kind of elaborate trophy. It uses the groin vault. Next slide, next image. Yeah, it uses the groin vault, and you can see it here. The crossing, the grand diagonals that come across, but there's another rib in the middle, isn't there? The reason for that, of course, is that those diagonals have a large dimension. They're long, and they tend to be somewhat flattened because of their length. If we have a round vault, a round arch at the edges, the diagonal is a long distance, And the thought here, I think, was to give it a little help by putting something in the middle. And so we get this vault system that's going to be with us for quite some time. It's the sexpartite or six-part vault. It's kind of an odd duck, isn't it? But there it is. It's an expedient answer to the issue here at Saint-Étienne. Yeah, now here you can see it more clearly. And this, as I've said, is going to be with us for quite a long time. It's being supported here by these tall side walls, and there are side aisles, as you can see here, to either side of them, that help to buttress things. They tend to prop it up. We'll see at Durham shortly how elaborately that is worked out. But this gives you a clear view of that long diagonals and the intervening straight across rib of the sexpartite system. Now we come to our first really major building, a biggie, Durham. How many of you have been to Durham? Have some of you seen this building? Not too many. It's one of Europe's grand buildings, and I think too little visited, too little known. It stands on what is almost a peninsula carved out by the River Wear, as you see it here. The town itself is a delight, and the building is a great joy. It has been badly treated over time. In 18th century restoration, which can hardly be called that, 50 tons of masonry were removed from the exterior. Much of the Norman decoration ornament. It was begun in 1093, and next image, please. Yeah. And it marks a number of issues that we can find in it. It uses a four-part vault here, as you see. There isn't any middle prop. And this is a wonderful step forward. The Gothic, this is not yet that, will ultimately resolve itself into that same four-part system, having used the six-part for quite some time. Much too long, actually, when the model here for the four-part was available. It's a building of enormous solidity, very tough thing. I was here once at a Battle of Britain celebration, and it seemed the ideal building for a resolute Briton. Next image. This is a section, and this is a kind of drawing that we're going to, what have we got going on? That we're going to be referring to several times. It is cut through the building vertically, and again, I seem to have got these out of order. Let's have the next image, please. No, one more. No, I'm sorry. No, back up. I'm sorry to have messed these things up. Now let's go back to the section. Yeah, forward one more. Yeah. In the choir, the vaulting, as you see it here, is supported at the edges not by this is the nave. It's supported by walls in which there's a little arch where you see that little door up above the up above the masonry that's cut through here on the side aisle. There is a simple arch. And that is interesting because it tells us of a way of thinking. The builder at that point has made his major arch, and it will collapse without some kind of lateral support, but he's built a lateral support that is autonomous. If the vaulting is taken away, the lateral support remains. This, in the choir, in the nave, is changed. He has used not a complete arch, but a half arch. And this means, I think, that he's thinking of the parts as interdependent and not independent. You see the point. If the buttress is removed, the vault will collapse, but if the vault is removed, the buttress collapses as well. They become an interdependent system. And this is a rather interesting way of beginning to think about the fabric of the building, that it's made up of parts that are must correspond with one another and interact. Next image. And this will show you the scale of the building. There's a humanoid down there on the pavement. It's a building of grand dimension. Durham has more to tell us. Let's try the next image and see if I've got that right. Yes, I do, finally. If you look closely at this image, you can see that there you go. You can perhaps see, or maybe you can't, that this pattern of diagonally located squares on the column are made up of interchangeable blocks. And you can see that they were made in the lodge and not on site, because where they join, there's sometimes a little shaping of them to kind of bring them into alignment. They don't quite meet in the right way, and so they're kind of fudged a little bit. I don't know if you can make that out. It's evident in all the columns in some slight degree. What this tells us is that the building was fabricated, the parts were made in the lodge. All of them prefabricated, and on site was just a matter of assembly, not of fabrication. And this is obviously important because it means you can work through bad weather. You could work year-round in making the parts, and then put them together, and once you got the roof on, it was a matter then of just finishing the building out. It was in its lower stages would then have been virtually complete. But it has some other implications. The pattern around the column has to close. You can't just make a bunch of blocks and hope that the thing will come out right when you get right the way around it. The diameter of the column then has to be a function, the circumference, the blocks have to be a function of the circumference of the column. What is the word I want? The sophistication, the planning, the design care of this is far greater than at first meets the eye. The patterns of the columns are functions of the circumference. They differ from column to column, but they indicate, I think, a grasp of mathematics, a grasp of planning, of care that is, I think, impressive even at this early stage. This would have been completed by 1120, long before we get to the first Gothic example at Saint-Denis. And already you can see that the process of building has reached a quite sophisticated point. So Durham tells us that. And in its scale, it tells us too of an ambition toward great size. Why all this effort? Like the Parthenon, it could have been done more simply. If the columns had simply been built of random blocks, it would have been a far simpler matter to accomplish this. But the patterning, the decoration was of such importance that it drove the decision to do it this way. The next big step, and I've overestimated my time today. I'm going to finish early, I think. The next big step is to exploit much of this at the Abbey of Saint-Dennis, and we're going to be talking about that next time. It was then a solving of these many problems that I've tried to present today. The problem of light and of masonry vaulting. You see how far we've come now from conch. We're now into a system that is of considerable sophistication in its interaction of parts. The development of the building trade to this degree of planning, prefabrication, and we are at the threshold now of that system that we'll see next time of the order that encompasses and welcomes ultimate complexity. And with that, I'm finishing a little early today. I'm surprising myself, but it leaves us some time for discussion if you'd like to talk about these things. I'd be glad to. Yes. What? Who has a question to pose? Yes, hello.
Yeah. One back there.
Hello.
Thank you. Why don't you take from the little one from this side?
In trying to go fast to get through the material, I went too fast.
Grant,
Yes.
how are these magnificent buildings paid for?
How are they paid for? That is a nice question. In England, we'll see that they're paid for by wool.
By what?
By wool. By wool. It's a very nice question. In France, it's really a beautiful conjunction of money and construction. There is evidence from those who probe this kind of thing that the century in France from about 1125 to 1225 was the greatest century of wine that France has ever experienced. And it was wine that paid for it. And it's interesting how close the dates are. 1125, you harvest. By 1145, it's at its peak. And 1145 is just the appearance of the Gothic. At 1225, you harvest, and by 1245, 1250, it's at its ideal. That is the end of the last Gothic effort in France. The timing is absolutely perfect. And what better source of money in France than the wine? It's the wine that builds the cathedrals. Yeah. And England, of course, the sheep keep reproducing, and we don't run out of sheep. And the Brits keep. From 1250, about the end of the work in France, to really 1515, England is doing the most forward-looking, most inventive, and I think in its way the most beautiful work in Europe. Yeah.
Grant?
Yes.
You said that these are not yet Gothic cathedrals, and I suppose next week you will define Gothic so we can know what it is. But what style of architecture are these?
They're called Romanesque.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what are the distinguishing features of Romanesque?
They're still stuck with the round arch. And I'm giving the game away here a little bit, but I'll say it anyway. The Gothic is, the round arch has the problem that the height is half the span, and that's a fixed relationship. A round arch is, the height is half the span. A pointed arch, and here is where we get an order that accepts all variety. With a pointed arch, the height can be anything. You can have a very shallow pointed arch, or it can reach well upward, and that means that many of the problems that we'll see the round arch facing are going to be sorted out by the pointed arch that was not invented, but its usefulness was seen by the master who built the Abbey of Saint-Dennis in 1144. I wanted to add to that. You've seen some of the problem in the sexpartite vault, that tied to the round arch at the edges, you wind up with a long, shallow diagonal. With a pointed arch, you can raise the sides to any height you wish and bring a pointed rib across the diagonal if you wish, and it can be as strong as you wish to make it. It isn't flattened, and the reach is excessive for the height. We'll talk about that more, but that is the distinguishing thing. Other things have been mentioned, the stained glass, the flying buttress, although that appears after, we would say, the Gothic has begun. And we'll talk about that in terms of Notre Dame in Paris, where it's invented. I'm not sure that the discussion of Notre Dame Paris that has appeared in connection with its restoration has emphasized that, but the flyer was invented at Paris as an expedient in about 1180, I would have said, as a way of propping up a failing structure. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But those are I would say, the defining things of the Gothic. The pointed arch above all. Yeah. Yes. Hello.
You have John Saracen.
Yeah.
John Saracen is
I'm rather glad we're having this chance to talk.
Grant, I'd be interested in your thoughts about the development from the Romanesque to the Gothic, because I personally prefer Romanesque to the Gothic. And when I look at the Romanesque, I think about primitivism, charm. And when I think about the Gothic, I think about grand and highly sophisticated. What was the thinking of the development? What was the thinking of the development from the Romanesque to the Gothic?
Well, I've begun to answer that. It was a question of solving the problem of the round arch, which is real, and of devising a system which the Romanesque did not, of an order that is accepting of ultimate variety, infinite variety. I think that was a piece of it. Your taste for the Romanesque was shared by a good friend of mine, now no longer among us, but he too favored that, and fair enough. It's a more robust style. I can love both of them, I think. I find Durham a wonderful building. I love it, but love is going to be a word you'll hear a lot in this course. I love a lot of these buildings. I think my preference is probably for the Gothic in that it represents a development that answers some real questions and produces a style of great elegance to my eye, but I'm not trying to talk you out of your preferences. Each to his own taste. I wanted to say one thing, though, that I should have mentioned in terms of Durham. A column such as this will buckle unless its force that it's accepting is concentrated within the middle third. That means that in putting up a building like this, and we'll see this in the Gothic in extreme form, the builder must, when he places the base of that column, have a very good idea of what's going to happen above, because he must build this in such a way that the forces come down not in the totality of that diameter, but in the middle third of it. And that, I think you may be surprised to hear that. It astonishes me that that precision demanded is achieved in all of these buildings. One of the things that helps the mason is that a masonry structure will tell you much about what it's doing. As it goes up, if the wall is tending to buckle, it will tell the mason that by showing some cracks on the exterior, and measures can be taken to remedy that. This is what happens at Paris when the flying buttress is invented. So in a way, it tells you how it's behaving as it's being put up, and that, as I've already said, is a considerable help to the mason in knowing what's going on. The stone also is much easier to work than you might imagine. When it comes from the quarry, it's very soft stuff. I have seen a piece from the quarry sawn through by an ordinary handsaw more easily than you could cut a 2x4. It hardens over time until it becomes very hard indeed on the exterior, but that outer shell is all that hardens. The problem of polluted rain on these buildings has been severe. At Salisbury, it's gone right through that hard outer shell and got into the soft inner stuff, and there the erosion of the material is severe and awful to behold. But it's very soft, very easily worked when it's first drawn from the quarry. You know. Yeah, whatever, we can stay for however long, yes.
Okay, over here is
Yeah, where are we? Yes, yeah, hi. Oh, Henry, hello, and back there is someone, yeah, Henry. Oh, he needs a mic.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
One of the fascinating elements of Durham, and Margaret quite sophisticated, is the alternating rhythm of supports. We get a round column and we get a composite column.
Yes.
Is this something that became adherent in the Gothic?
Only in subtleties. At Chartres, the alternation is from a round to an octagonal to a round, which is hardly noticeable because of the shafts that attach to it. But that remains, and here and there. Henry is pointing out that at Durham there's a compound pier, we would call it, and then the round column. They alternate, and it's I don't know why that's done. I don't know the story behind that. Yeah.
It is fascinating.
Pardon me?
But it is fascinating.
Yes, it is. Yeah. There's someone way in the back. Yeah.
Are the architects known, or are they anonymous?
Are the architects known? Yes. Well, they were. There's a movie about Exeter that closes with the line, "The architect of Exeter Cathedral is unknown," implying that they were anonymous. That isn't true. In almost every case, the architect was known, but the name has been lost over time. We know at Reims Cathedral all four of the architects, and they are an interesting story. Jean d'Orbay, Jean Leloup, Bernard de Soissons, and Gaucher de Reims. And that one is interesting because the first three are itinerant masons who move from job to job. Gaucher de Reims is there for 35 years. That is the beginning of architect as opposed to master mason. And so we do know that name. We would have known at Chartres. We would have known at almost every site. We know at Amiens, Robert de Visage. We know many of them. And yes, they would have been known, Connie. Nice point. Yeah.
Yeah. Grant. Thank you. One of the cathedrals, you talk about the engineering of these cathedrals and the stresses on them. There's a cathedral in England where one day, one of the towers just broke off and fell flat.
Ely.
Is it Ely?
Yes.
Okay, I was trying to remember which one.
Yeah, Ely. Yeah, I wrote a poem about that. And we'll get to that later, but it was
Ely is
Ely.
an interesting cathedral.
Ely is a fascinating building.
It is.
Yes.
Well, the nave is Norman, and then you come into the transept and you step into the Renaissance. I spent a year in Cambridge, and we lived.
Yes, you did, just south of there.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say Renaissance at all, but that crossing is a magnificent thing, isn't it?
But it's a stylistic change, certainly.
Well, to some extent, yes, it is. Yeah, the nave is quite early on, very early on, with the wooden roof, not a vault.
Well, thank you. I've been fretting about this and trying to remember.
Yeah, but that half of the west front collapsed. You're quite right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I guess there was a question over here. This lady over here.
Hi, not really well, kind of a question. Is this on?
Yes.
Well, this column from Durham, and there's this magnificent pattern on it, which is what I thought you were referring to when you were talking about that pieces put together, individual pieces to support it. But then I went up and looked close up, and that's the artistic on top of all of these small pieces, smaller than the pattern. So I was just in support of making I haven't been there, and the value of making a close-up shot of that would be terrific. Here's all.
Okay, let's have 2 more questions, and then...
I'll try to bring in an image closer up of that next time around. I can do that.
I just went up.
Yes, I'll do that. Yeah, thank you.
Grant,
Yes.
you talked about how the weight of that column had to be borne by the center of the column.
Yes.
How is that constructed inside? I mean, is it masonry just blocks on top of one another, or is there some other
At Durham, I
construction
don't know.
inside?
I don't know the case at Durham. In many instances, we know Reims quite well because it was so badly destroyed in the First War. But I don't know at Durham. In many cases, including Reims, it's loose rubble masonry with a lot of mortar shoved in to make up the voids, which works just fine. I mean, nothing wrong with it. But it's not finished material. The outside is finished and the interior is a rubble core. That's true at Reims, and I suppose it's true at many of the other sites. At Noyon, we know, again, because of damage.
Grant, I had,
Over here, we have one last question.
Oh, we can take more, that's fine, yes, hello.
I'd like you to go back to how these were paid for. You said wool in England, why?
Yes.
Are they a tax on the producers, or, what was the mechanism to get people to give up that much money?
Well, for one thing, the society was simpler then. There was no interstate highway system. There was no program for the B-2 bomber or the aircraft carrier. Capital, money, needs to find some home, and the architectural programs were one of few places where it could find that home, and it went into the churches and the cathedrals. You asked by way of tax. I don't know to that degree what the transfer of the resources was. I can't tell you that.
Well, thank you so much, Grant. That was just elegant. We look forward to 7 more weeks of his lectures. And if there are any remaining questions, why don't you come up and ask them here. Anyway, thank you very much.
I'm glad to talk with any of you if you'd like to stop by.